Hello, good morning. Dignitaries of the dais, friends, ladies, gentlemen, and members of the press. I'm deeply honored and privileged to be providing the keynote address for the 14th International Conference organized by IPSA. And I would like to join the previous speakers in welcoming all of you, those who have come from virtually every continent in the world, except perhaps the Arctic and the Antarctica. I think every other continent has been represented. And I'd like to welcome you to this lovely city of Hyderabad. Don't forget to collect your pearls before you leave the city. The timing of this conference, in a sense, is coincidental. It's also very fortuitous. As my good friend Raghupati just mentioned, that this conference is taking place at the same time when the COP 21st conference on the global climate change is taking place in Paris. One cannot help but be guided by some of the deliberations at the COP conference in Paris, because they are bound to impact the pace and development of what you are planning to do in the building sector. At the same time, just 250 kilometers south of Hyderabad, we are seeing a city of Chennai, the fourth largest metropolitan city of Chennai, inundated by floods. The unfolding of the impact of climate change. So two events taking place at the same time. One, which is a harbinger of hope in Paris, and another, a reminder of nature's fury, that if we do not take heed, climate change and its effect are already upon us. The future, ladies and gentlemen, is now. Much hope rests on the Paris conference. Unlike previous summits, and the first summit I was fortunate enough to participate in 1992 in Rio. And since then, several other summits have taken place. But this summit, there's no question, the science of climate change has been accepted by all. And various countries, in fact, 190 countries have submitted the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions, their plans to address reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The United States has offered to reduce its emissions by 28% or thereabouts by 2030 over 2005 levels. The European Union has similarly offered a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 over 2005 levels. China has offered to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. They said they will peak at 2030 and reduce thereafter. India has offered to reduce its energy intensity, improve its energy productivity by 28 to 33% over 2005 levels by 2030. And all of this, I think, taken together, along with the agreements and the INDCs submitted by the other countries, all taken together, it's a moot point whether the 2-degree centigrade line will be breached or not. There have been apprehensions that this is not good enough and more needs to be done, and we will indeed might breach the 2-degree centigrade Rubicon line, which means that all bets are off and we are entering an era of irreversibility. But be that as it may, it's an important step where the world has come together and has agreed to a plan of action. Another way of looking at this is carbon space. 3,000 billion tons of carbon space was available at the turn of the Industrial Revolution. Today, 2,000 billion tons has been occupied and only 1,000 billion tons available. And the argument goes that much of the 2,000 that was occupied was taken up by the developed nations, and perhaps now is the time for developing countries to be given a larger space in the remaining carbon space. The issue of climate change is not, and we in India sometimes think it's only restricted to this region, but certainly not. The entire area from North Africa to Bangladesh is susceptible. Ironically, many of the countries in this belt is on the Earth's poverty belt, but ironically, they're also on the Earth's sun belt. But India has very high stakes, as the situation in Chennai indicates, that it's disproportionately vulnerable to natural disasters. Someone has predicted that New Orleans will have to relocate in the next 50 to 70 years. But Indian coastal cities might disappear as human habitats much before that. But coming back to the Paris discussions, and very briefly, India's principle is simple and direct. Equity and sustainability of global actions underpinned by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So given this backdrop on climate change, I would like to spend the next 30 or 35 minutes on the unique nature of the challenge that India faces in meeting its INDC goals, and would conclude that it's possible through a massive tectonic shift to green technologies brought to market and scale through the application of innovative approaches. I would hope that this provides the backdrop and context to your own deliberations in advancing energy performance simulation in the building sector. In India, 38% or thereabouts of the primary energy consumption is in the building sector. It's the largest sector which consumes energy. And as you would probably know, and certainly you'll hear it from the experts from India, that 70% of the buildings which will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. So it does not require rocket science to figure out that the success or failure of India's goal to reduce its energy intensity by 28% by 2030 is intimately linked to how the building sector performs. And this is not just true of India, but is also true of other developing countries. So the question that I'd like to pose, and hopefully try to answer, are what are the long-range influences in India to carbon mitigation and climate sustainability? And how do we address these green technology shifts if we are to meet or exceed the energy productivity targets? Two complementary areas of focus. One is green shifts of a tectonic scale, and number two, implementation strategy to generate marketplace of green ideas to set up centers of innovation. What are green tectonic shifts? I call them tectonic because they're structural, they're large, they're massive, and they have to be done in quick time. There are three key ones. In fact, there are several, but there are three key tectonic shifts. The first is moving decisively towards the demand side of the energy equation. We need to work on both sides of the energy equation, but we need to move more decisively to the demand side of the energy equation. India has done rather well on the supply side of the energy equation. Today, India's total power generation capacity is 250,000 megawatts. We are the fifth largest in the world in terms of generation capacity after the United States, China, Russia, and the European Union. India's generation capacity is larger than that of the UK, larger than that of France, is equal to that of Japan, a little larger than Japan as a matter of fact, and greater than all countries of sub-Saharan Africa. On the coal side, India produces 0.5 billion tons of coal every year. You must see this in the context of what it was just 60 years ago. At the time of India's independence, India's total generation capacity was a mere 1,000 megawatts, just in a few cities and towns. Today is 250,000 megawatts. In terms of coal production, India produced barely 50 million tons. Today it produces 500 million tons. In terms of oil, obviously it imports much of its oil. This is not an oil-producing region, it's neither a gas-producing region. It has a fair amount of hydropower, and much of the hydropower has generally plateaued out. So essentially, on the supply side, the country has done reasonably well. But the context in which we are talking about is moving towards the demand side. And why are we talking about the demand side? And there are very, very strong and good reasons. It's a universal thumb of rule that it costs a fifth to a tenth to save a unit of energy than it costs to generate an equivalent amount of energy, and is no different in India. Energy efficiency employs a lot more people than what energy capacity additions do. This is a very young country. As our Prime Minister often says, 65% of the population is below the age of 30. Employment is key. Efficiency can bring about a lot more employment than equivalent supply. Also, a point which I'll be referring to again a little later is energy efficiency can make a major impact on the fiscal deficit of this country. As a matter of fact, as some of you probably might know, the International Energy Agency has declared energy efficiency as the first fuel. In the 90s, it was considered to be the fifth or the sixth fuel. But IEA, after it reviewed efficiency programs in 11 countries of the IEA between 2001 to 2011, determined that energy efficiency programs and projects and activities has saved more energy than projects on the supply side in terms of coal, production, oil, power generation, and so on. And this has happened in country after country. And that actually prompted them to declare that energy efficiency is not the second fuel, it's not the third fuel, it's the first fuel. If energy efficiency is contributing to the energy balance in such a significant way, the question is, how do you situate energy efficiency as the first fuel in a developing country like India, an energy resource in the country's planning process? When you think of a country like India, one must recognize certain ground realities. And one of the ground realities is that there is a huge gap between demand and supply. Demand has overtaken supply to an extent that whatever capacities that you add is still not sufficient to bridge the gap. This is very, very different from the Western world, where demand and supply are in balance, and if one were to cut down demand through efficiency, then one can immediately see an impact on the supply side. A power plant might be taken offline. In India, it's not so. Whatever you do on the efficiency, through efficiency on the supply, on the demand side, will not automatically relate to a reduction of supply capacities because of the gap. What you would really do is reduce the rate of addition of supply in future, but you would not immediately reduce a power plant. That gives a different connotation to efficiency, because efficiency in a shortage situation and the planning process for efficiency in a shortage situation is very different from efficiency in a situation where demand and supply are balanced. So that's one thing unique about India. Another thing which is also different about India and some of the other developing countries, more so about India because of its large population of 1.2 billion, is the per capita consumption in India is very low. India consumes approximately 850 units per person per annum, as against 2,200 units per person per annum as the global average, 15,000 units per person per annum of the United States, 18,000 in some of the countries of Europe. So the per capita consumption is very low, but the intensity of energy use in some of the value-added sectors in India is high because of inefficiency. So in various industrial sectors, India could do a lot better by reducing its intensity of energy use. Although, as we would see a little later, the country has done quite well in that area too. Historically, the growth or the energy efficiency movement in India started quite early. Again, among the developing countries, India was probably the first country to have established an institutional response to energy crisis of 1973. And the way it has evolved over the past 40 years can be split into 3 time periods. Between 1973 till 2000, as a response to the oil price hike of 73, and the fact that the country had always to import 2/3 of its oil, since it doesn't produce much of it itself. Institutions were established within the country. Certain energy efficiency services were developed, such as energy audit services, and the government actually hunkered down and developed certain broad strategies. Ironically, the first report on energy efficiency, the Fuel Policy Committee report of 1972, looked at end-use sectors in India, but did not mention the building sector at all. They didn't consider the building sector to be an important sector. Following on the heels of that report was a report which I was tangentially involved in 1981-82, which was the Interministerial Working Group on Energy Efficiency. And that did mention the building sector, but in a short paragraph. In a report of 200 pages, there was a small paragraph which said, yes, the building sector is not that important. They use a bit of fans and they use a bit of lights, and that's it. Not a sector that you should look for energy savings. So during that period, the emphasis was largely in the value-added industrial sector and to some extent in the agricultural sector and the power sector. The next phase of efficiency was between 2000 to 2010, and that's when the building sector grew in prominence. And that was really because it suddenly became apparent to the planners that cities in India were suffering from peak load problems. And the contribution to peak load was largely because of air conditioning and to some extent because of lighting. And since the power sector in India began to get prominence in the planning process and power sector reforms began to take place, it also immediately meant that something needs to be done to improve load management, and so the building sector gained prominence. It's also coincidental that in the period 2000 to 2010, India opened up to the rest of the world in terms of economic development, reforms, and there were a number of donors who began to participate in the Indian energy planning process. The World Bank, bilaterals like AID and DFID and GIZ, national labs in the United States coming in through USAID programs, and the US DOE partnership with the government of India under the strategic dialogue. All of this enabled, to some extent, the transfer of knowledge and information on green buildings and the green building movement, which Raghupati mentioned to you. Now we are on to the third time period, 2010 onwards. Here, the challenge has been that the public policy, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency was set up in the year 2000. The Energy Conservation Act was promulgated in 2001, and a number of regulatory measures have been announced. The issue was that these public policy pronouncements did not team very well with market policies. And today, I think to a large extent, the focus has been, how do you accelerate energy efficiency? How do you make it a center stage in the planning process? How do you make it part of corporate strategy? What are the financial incentives to advance energy efficiency? And so on and so forth. The teaming of market and business policy with public policy is something that India is wrestling with. But challenges remain. And I'm very glad that the Secretary IT of the government of Telangana is here. And the government of Telangana and the government of Andhra Pradesh have done rather well in setting up capacities within their state to advance both renewables and efficiency through what is known as state nodal agencies. Promulgating policies at the center is one thing, but moving energy efficiency from the center to the states is another thing, and for which you need local capacity. And our local capacity in many of Indian states, and some of the Indian states as large as countries, Andhra Pradesh is the size of France, it has a population of 70, 80 million. They need to get the capacity development and skill development necessary to design and manage and implement an efficiency program. And they're doing, as I said, quite well because their state nodal agency has had a good track record. But one can't say the same of the other states. So the challenge remains is how do we move energy efficiency from the state, from the center to the states. The other challenges, and I alluded to it, we have the value-added industrial sector, which has been the target for energy efficiency right from the very beginning, and for good reason, because costs of energy to the industrial sector, and we have our friends from the Confederation of Indian Industry here who would testify to that, is very high. Therefore, most industries, at least the organized sector of Indian industry, have been able to incorporate energy efficiency as part of their corporate practice. But within the industrial sector, there's a wide bandwidth. For instance, you have some of the most energy efficient cement industry in India, in the world. They have energy productivity indices which are better than most other similar industries all over the world. But in the same sector, there are several other laggards, industries which are not that very efficient. And you see that in industry after industry after industry. So essentially, the challenge is how do we replicate some of the successes in certain sectors of industry so that the others in the same sector are able to adopt. And one of the reasons why some of the sectors of industry have done well is they're able to move the subject of efficiency from what I've often referred to as a boiler room engineering subject to the boardroom. And this is where I think the building sector, at least in the Indian context, can be an example to emulate for the other sectors. The building sector, as we heard, has not totally, but substantially, at least among corporate India, adopted the green building movement. The green building movement is more of a boardroom subject than a subject at the boiler room. And how they have done it and the processes by which they went through is a fascinating area. I don't have the time to get into it, but to have almost 4,000 green buildings, starting with just one 15 years ago, and to have a green building space of 3 billion square feet, starting with a very small base of 20,000 square feet, which was the Green Business Center's green building, Platinum Order green building in Hyderabad, means that there has been certain forces at work to raise the green building movement from an notion, an idea which a few architects had, up the scale to the corporate level. But is that enough? We need to sell the idea of energy efficiency and the concept of energy efficiency along different lines. No longer would the argument that energy efficiency is a bottom line issue or reduce GHG emissions is sufficient enough to motivate consumers to adopt efficiency. In fact, somebody said in Paris the other day that the standout point about the 21st meeting of the Conference of Parties is that there's a universal recognition among all the countries that we would adopt GHG mitigation measures not to save the planet, not to prevent climate change happening as much as to advance our own self-interest. I think that's a very, very important point. The world has moved to a point where the INDCs are actually a reflection of each country's self-interest too, to make carbon mitigation a business value. How can you grow your economy and at the same time reduce your carbon? And that's, I think, the challenge. So we need to sell the concept of efficiency a little differently than what has been done in the past. Let me give you an example. There was a study done by CEPT University in India, in a medium-sized city of the buildings, and they determined that a 1 unit reduction, 1 kilowatt hour per meter square reduction in energy consumption would result in approximately $11 million worth of financial savings for the city. And if we were to extrapolate it across the residential and the commercial sector and assume that there's approximately 50 units of energy per meter squared on the average that can be reduced, you'd come to a figure of approximately $550 million worth of savings for the city council, for the exchequer. Now, what that really means in a country where capital is scarce is that this money can be used in the social sectors. As a matter of fact, in this particular city, it was determined that the savings is sufficient to pay for another 1,000 primary schools and another 500 healthcare centers, and every school would have a blackboard and running water facilities. Essentially, in a country like India where capital is scarce, where the government is hard put to meet its obligations in the social sectors, saving of energy can be a powerful argument to reduce the fiscal deficit and to employ the saved resources to sectors which are in need. That is where self-interest lies. And if we can determine in the building sector, given the opportunities, that the building sector can advance the self-interest of countries and of regions, then I think we will be giving energy efficiency a very, very major boost. So this was my first tectonic change, moving efficiency from the moving from the supply side orientation to the demand side orientation. My second green tectonic change, and no prizes for guessing what it is moving aggressively towards renewable energy and doing it in a way which is integrated with the efficiency opportunities. That renewable energy and energy efficiency are really two sides of the same coin. So if you want to move from a world dominated by oil and coal and fossil fuels to a world of renewable energy, the vehicle to do so would be energy efficiency, because efficiency would bring about the economics that renewable energy currently doesn't have. And in this context, India has declared that it would add another 175 gigawatts of renewable energy between now and 2022, in another 7 years, of which almost 100 gigawatts would be solar energy, the largest procurement of renewable energy worldwide outside possibly of Germany is taking place in India, where such large additions are being planned. It's not that things are moving exactly the way it ought to. There are issues, but slowly but surely, some of the issues, at least at the policy end and the regulatory end, are being addressed. For example, one of the drivers for the renewable energy program are renewable portfolio obligations that every state in India has been mandated to adopt, that a certain percentage of the energy would be used in the state will be from renewable sources. Compliance has been an issue. We need to make it mandatory. Some work is going along in that direction. But one needs to look at the renewable energy program and the expansion of the program through the lens of another major issue in the Indian context. And this issue is something which might be of interest to those who are from the developed countries and may not be aware of the ground realities in the Indian context as far as energy access goes. Today, out of a population of 1.2 billion, almost 400 million people are either unserved or underserved. There are 18,000 villages in the country out of 600,000 villages which don't have any electricity and no hope for getting any electricity because either they are too remote, up on mountain tops, middle of deserts, in islands, in rivers, and so on. And these 18,000 villages need to be served. And in addition to that, there are in existing villages which are connected to the grid, but still all households in the village do not receive electricity. This is a key market. This is a key development issue. No government can ignore this. In order to advance power, which is a key indicator for economic growth and prosperity for these villages, the country had, right from the time of independence, been relying on extension of the grid. Today, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that one would have to subsidize the energy costs to remote villages and villagers and the farming community in general, and the fact that there are significant losses which take place in the distribution of power to such remote areas. It is clear that renewable energy through decentralized sources for power generation and for power supply is the option to move forward on. Now let me give you a quick example. India requires between now and 2030 almost $1 trillion worth of investment for the energy sector, largely in power generation, transmission, and distribution. If you were to assume for a moment that even 10% of this, or approximately $100 billion, would be used for rural electrification, and 50% of that can be for this distributed generation, then we are talking about $50 billion, or approximately $3.5 billion every year between now and 2030, the remaining 15 years. What's currently happening is distributed generation is being supported by a few donors, by the government, by philanthropists. And they are not certainly putting $3.5 billion a year into this sector. So their investments are marginal, not more than a couple of $1 million. So clearly, mobilizing resources through traditional ways is not going to cut it. The country will have to look at ways in which they can raise both debt and equity from capital markets. And that is the challenge. The challenge of making these projects financially viable and access to finance through business opportunities is, I think, the most important step. However, being on this area of moving the country decisively into renewable energy, one has to think in terms of outside the box. I was just talking this morning over breakfast with Professor Bansal, who mentioned that if India were to add 100,000 megawatts of renewable, then there's this question of balancing, because we all know that renewable energy is intermittent, and integration of renewable energy into the grid is the single most largest issue and a problem. And the way to balance supply and demand is to have supply sources available every time the renewable energy drops off the grid, because it, as I said, is intermittent. Solar is only during the day, wind is only for during certain periods of the year, and so on and so forth. How do you ensure that supply is constant, because there's always demand from the grid, and you will have to back renewables with balancing power, be it hydro, be it gas, because these are the peaking opportunities in a country like India, and India doesn't have enough gas, it doesn't have enough hydro. So what is the one or two major steps the country can do to provide this balancing power? An opportunity that improves energy security in the region, an opportunity that provides this balancing power, as well as creates harmony among the nations in South Asia, is if India were to able to advance cross-border energy trade with some of the countries in the neighborhood, such as Nepal. Nepal has huge hydro resources. It has tapped less than 2% of its hydro resources, but the market for hydropower in Nepal is really not in Nepal. It's in India, which is hungry for power. So if one could think of ways in which one can establish large-scale private or public power projects in Nepal, ostensibly to sell the power both to Nepal for their requirements, but also export it to the Indian grid and act as a balancing power for India's renewable energy, would be the single largest way in which one can sustain the renewable energy program of this country. I mention this because increasingly one has to look at solutions outside the boundary of countries. And this is one just solution. I've talked about two tectonic shifts. I've talked about energy efficiency moving from the supply to the demand side, and I've talked about the need to accelerate renewable energy. There's a third tectonic shift. It is contentious. It has raised the hackles of many of our fellow participants in Paris, where there's a lot of pressure on India to move from coal. It's very clear that in a country like India, where almost 75% of its power generation capacity is coal, coal is the major energy resource of the country, and it's a resource on which the entire power sector depends on. The quality of coal is very different in India. It's very poor. But nevertheless, over the last several years, through indigenous research and development, the Indians have been able to deal with their poor quality coal, high ash content coal, very abrasive coal, and run power plants. There's almost 180,000 megawatts of coal generation capacity in the country, which is the fourth or fifth largest coal generation capacity in the world. The National Thermal Power Corporation, which is approximately about 45,000 megawatts, will double its capacity by 2025, making it the single largest utility in the world when it's 90,000 megawatts. And much of it would be on coal, although they'll have a little bit of gas too. So coal has been the major energy resource, and it'll be exceedingly difficult for India to move from coal to an alternate source, unless, as somebody said in Paris, if the developed world were to finance India's transition from coal to renewable energy. But be that as it may, if coal is going to continue, as it is continuing in China, to be the mainstay, then there are a lot of opportunities for introduction of clean coal technologies, introduction of technologies to reduce energy consumption in power plants, improve heat rates of power plants, improve the quality of coal through beneficiation, to improve efficiency through supercritical and ultra-supercritical systems, and so on and so forth. So this requires both capital as well as a whole lot of technological prowess which the country would have to exercise. The three tectonic shifts that I mentioned, necessary for India to meet the challenges to reduce its energy intensity by 2030, are not the only three challenges. There are many more. Lack of time prevents me from getting into a few others. But there is one more which is very unique to this state of Andhra Pradesh and to many other states which are largely agricultural, what I call as the energy-water nexus, where it's possible to make dramatic improvements in water use efficiency to reduce energy consumption through a co-management approach of water and energy. Let me, I don't know how I'm doing on time. Is it okay? Another 10 minutes? Okay. Let me conclude with a positive note. Delivering the three tectonic shifts, which I mentioned, after I have defined what the challenges are, require an ecosystem to deliver these green shifts. But the fundamental premise of this ecosystem must be based on what I call as the principle of inclusive growth. That is, every segment must be benefited. Clearly, you cannot talk about a tectonic shift without looking at the fact that there are 400 million people who don't have access to electricity. They must be part of the solution. Clearly, you cannot look at a tectonic shift for energy efficiency if you don't look at the fact that there are certain sectors which don't have access to social services because other sectors, being inefficient, are taking a lion's share of the government's resources. So whatever efficiency gains in one sector must be made available to the other sector. So I call this as the inclusive growth innovation ecosystem for green technology shifts. It should be dynamic, it will be market-driven, and it will establish alliances among stakeholders. We live in an era of globalization and integration, and we cannot afford to live or work in silos. But the reality is that there is a disconnect between various stakeholders. There is, for instance, in India, a disconnect between the science, enterprise world and the world of finance. We need to create institutional alliances between these various entities. This disconnect between the world of finance and enterprise, and I was talking to some people last night about it, has been the single largest impediment to move technologies into the marketplace. This needs to be reversed. And this is where I think the green building movement has a model which others can emulate. I've been very impressed by what I heard about IPSA. It's an alliance of architects, of academicians, of builders, policymakers, environmentalists, and others dedicated to sustainable development of the built habitat. It's a model, as I said, for others to emulate. The use of analytical tools to inform policy and to inform markets. We need to do more of it. And I hope this conference, the 14th conference, will set its goals to align with the global challenge of climate change in the building sector in India, a point that was alluded to in the morning session and which I had also underscored, that the building sector could be the pincer edge for energy efficiency in India for it to meet its goals of reduction of energy intensity by 28% by 2030 over 2005 levels. The building sector could be the role model, and the building sector has the alliances, the Green Building Council, the various rating systems, the various standards of the Government of India, which I forgot to mention, the Energy Conservation Building Code, the National Building Code, the GRIHA, the LEEDs. So there have been a fair amount of stakeholder partnership and discussions taking place in the building sector, which could serve as an example of various entities coming together and delivering on some of the opportunities. And with this, I would like to conclude and like to wish your discussions all success, and thank you for having me here. Thank you.